The steady hum of the car heater did nothing to stop my shivering in the urgent care parking lot, a quiet place to sit and realize I had just lost my entire family. I leaned my head against the steering wheel, trying to ignore the sharp, metallic taste of copper coating my tongue. A pulsing throb radiated up my left wrist, a bitter souvenir from hitting the hardwood floor just hours ago. The glaring screen of my personal phone illuminated the dark cabin. Dozens of missed calls crowded the screen. Most were from my mother, and many more were from my younger sister, Chelsea. At 38 years old, I spent my days as the CEO of Hale Neuromotion, building robotic systems to help stroke patients walk again. I fixed broken pathways. I helped people recover for a living. But the people calling me right now were not looking for healing. They were panicking because their elaborate plan was falling apart. My work phone buzzed softly in the cup holder. "Just one call," I answered. And my attorney, Elena, skipped the pleasantries entirely. She told me the broker representing our rival company had just sent an emergency request. Chelsea had guaranteed them 25% of my company in writing, and now the buyers wanted proof of ownership before midnight. 7 hours earlier, the only thing on my mind was surviving another tense dinner. The drive to the private dining room at the Cary Country Club had been quiet and dark. A light rain slicked the North Carolina roads, and wet red oak leaves clung to the edges of my windshield. The temperature sat comfortably around 64 degrees, just cool enough for the light blazer I wore over a silk blouse. It was Friday, October 16th, 2026, a completely normal autumn evening. I parked near the exit, a defensive habit I had developed over the last year. Before walking inside, I sent a quick text to Elena on my work phone, instructing her to stand by if my relatives brought up our confidential valuation or patent rights. Then I silenced the device, slipped it into my left pocket, and put my personal phone in my right. The private dining room smelled heavily of roasted garlic, expensive wine, and old money. Chelsea sat across the table, swirling a glass of Merlot. My younger sister beamed at me, her perfect smile revealing none of the hostility we usually shared in private. Beside her sat our mother, Barbara, already 3 sentences deep into a recycled story about the sacrifices she made when we were growing up. And then there was Craig, my uncle, who also happened to be our chief financial officer, sat comfortably at the head of the table. I had hired him 9 years ago when he lost his previous job, yet he was sitting here tonight without an invitation, perfectly playing the role of the benevolent patriarch. A thick cream folder rested right next to my dinner plate. I did not touch it, though my eyes lingered on the heavy cardstock. Chelsea leaned forward, resting her elbows on the white tablecloth, and her voice dripped with practiced sweetness. She explained that she did not want a salary from the company anymore. She did not want a consulting contract, and she certainly did not want stock options. She wanted ownership. Real, immediate ownership. Craig nodded slowly, using his most reasonable, calming tone. He assured me that I would still have more than enough wealth left over. It was only fair, he argued smoothly, since the family was building this empire together. I kept my hands folded quietly in my lap, feeling the distinct weight of the 2 phones in my pockets, and asked 3 simple questions. Why 25%? Who prepared these documents? And where did you get the $50 million valuation? Silence fell over the room like a heavy blanket. The clinking of silverware stopped completely. Chelsea blinked, and tears pooled instantly in her eyes as she looked to our mother for backup. Mom slammed her flat palm on the table, rattling the crystal water glasses. She yelled that I was being deeply ungrateful, that Craig had already checked the core patent consent, and that this transfer was a done deal whether I liked it or not. Craig checked the core patent consent. The words hung in the quiet air between us, confirming everything I had suspected for the past 3 weeks. I looked down at the cover page of the transfer agreement peeking out of the folder. Right beneath it sat an irrevocable voting proxy, along with a side letter allowing Chelsea to coordinate her voting rights with a rival buyer. This was not a spontaneous emotional plea from a younger sister feeling left out. This was a hostile corporate takeover orchestrated over appetizers. I picked up my linen napkin, folded it neatly, and placed it on the table. I told them no one gets a piece of my company simply because we share blood. Mom stood up, her chair scraping violently against the floorboards, and pointed a trembling finger right at my face. Give her 25% or you are not family, she said, her voice echoing sharply off the wood-paneled walls. I stayed perfectly seated. I looked up at her and said that was a price I was perfectly willing to pay. The woman who raised me closed the distance between us in 2 rapid strides and struck the side of my face. The sharp crack of her palm against my cheek was deafening. Because I was sitting near the edge of my seat, the impact threw me off balance. My chair tilted backward. The back wooden leg caught on the thick edge of the oriental rug, and I went down hard. My hip struck the floor first, followed immediately by my left wrist as I instinctively tried to break the fall. Pain flared up my arm in a hot flash. For a split second, the room spun. Somewhere above me, someone gasped in shock, likely a waiter standing out in the hallway. As I pushed myself up onto my hands and knees, my eyes landed on the scattered papers. The thick cream folder had spilled open across the rug. I stared at the bottom right corner of the stock transfer agreement. Printed in tiny black letters was a document code, C7H50. A sudden, freezing clarity washed over my entire body. I stood up, smoothing the front of my blazer with my good hand. I ignored the intense stinging in my cheek and the metallic taste pooling in my mouth. I looked at the 3 people staring back at me. Mom breathed heavily, her hand still raised slightly. Chelsea covered her mouth in dramatic horror. Craig just looked pale. I smiled at them. "Thank you," I said, my voice perfectly steady in the quiet room. That answered the only question I came here to ask. I picked up my purse, leaving the legal folder scattered on the floor, and walked out the door without looking back. Now, sitting in the damp chill of the clinic parking lot, I watched another missed call register on my personal screen. They were panicking, and they absolutely should be, because the footer on Chelsea's transfer agreement carried the exact security code I had given to only one person in the entire world. My Uncle Craig. The rain drummed steadily against the metal roof of my car, a heavy, rhythmic sound that offered the only comfort in the empty clinic parking lot. I leaned my head back, feeling the freezing leather of the steering wheel against my uninjured palm. A sharp, chemical smell of wet asphalt and motor oil leaked through the air vents, grounding me in the present. My left cheek radiated a dull, pulsing heat, and every time I shifted my weight, my bruised wrist screamed in protest. Before shifting into drive, I turned on the interior light and flipped down the visor. The mirror reflected an angry red handprint blooming across my jaw. I held up my personal phone, ignoring the endless stream of incoming text messages, and took 3 clear photos of my face. Then I photographed my swollen wrist. I uploaded the images directly to a secure cloud server, ensuring they were date-stamped and locked away from my camera roll. I picked up my work phone and dialed my attorney. Elena answered on the first ring. Her voice was calm and measured as I gave her the bare facts of the evening. The physical assault, the specific document code printed on the transfer packet, and the exact location of the private dining room. Elena told me to go straight into the urgent care center, avoid arguing with my family over text, and keep my uncle completely in the dark. While we spoke, she began drafting a formal preservation request to the country club management, legally demanding the security footage, the booking records, and written incident reports from any wait staff who witnessed the dinner. The clinic waiting room smelled sharply of industrial bleach and old magazines. A tired triage nurse recorded my vitals, and 20 minutes later, a physician examined my wrist. He noted the contusions carefully on my medical chart, his voice entirely neutral as he asked how the injuries had occurred. Heat rushed to my neck. Admitting that my mother struck me over a business dispute felt like swallowing dry sand. I told him the truth anyway. An hour later, sitting back in my car, I filed a non-emergency police report over the phone. I did not ask for a squad car to haul Barbara Hale out of her house in handcuffs. I simply needed the paper trail to exist, cementing the reality of what happened before my family could rewrite the narrative. By 8:15, I was sitting at the kitchen island in my townhouse, holding an ice pack against my cheek while staring at my laptop. Eleanor, our independent board chair, appeared on the secure video call alongside Daniel, the lead investor, Elena, and our security director, Caleb. I kept my camera off, claiming a poor internet connection so they would not see the swelling on my face. I explained the leak with quiet precision. I detailed the confidential valuation, the $50 million figure, and the C7H50 watermark. Craig was the only executive in the entire company who had received that specific draft. Eleanor listened without interrupting. The board chair did not immediately call for my uncle to be fired. She operated on rigid procedure, not emotion, which was exactly why I had appointed her. Eleanor formally approved a legal hold on all company communications and data. She ordered Caleb to suspend my uncle's privileged administrative access, while the special committee began a formal investigation. For now, our chief financial officer was quietly placed on paid leave. The governance system I had spent months building was working flawlessly. My personal phone vibrated constantly against the granite countertop. The text messages arrived in predictable, escalating waves. First came the demands from Mom, telling me to come back so we could talk like adults. Then came Chelsea, typing frantic paragraphs about how my selfishness had ruined everything we built. Craig offered smooth, calculated apologies, insisting the dinner was just a terrible misunderstanding. Distant relatives I had not spoken to in nearly a year chimed in, saying my mother was crying and I needed to fix it. I turned off the sound. I refused to answer, but I did not block a single number, because every message they sent was another piece of evidence. A new alert chimed on my work phone. Elena had forwarded an email from the compliance counsel at the brokerage firm representing our rival. I opened the attachment and found a scanned warranty agreement. Chelsea had signed her name on the dotted line, legally guaranteeing she could deliver 25% of my company and secure major holder rights within 48 hours. I read the signature twice. My younger sister had not just thrown a tantrum for attention. She had signed a binding financial commitment based entirely on assets she did not own. If she failed to deliver those shares, the broker would demand their massive retainer back, trapping Chelsea in a financial snare of her own making. The realization settled heavy in my chest, raising a terrifying question about exactly how far Craig was willing to go to help her steal the money to pay for it. Around midnight, my laptop screen blinked with a direct secure message from Caleb. He was monitoring the network activity logs in real time. My personal phone showed 83 missed calls, a testament to a family that believed I was sitting in the dark crying over a slap, waiting to surrender. They had no idea the trap was already springing shut around them. Caleb typed a short sentence confirming our security protocols were holding strong. At 11:58, someone using Craig's laptop tried to erase the folder, and our system copied every deleted file instead. The morning light filtered through the plantation shutters of my Raleigh townhouse. The silence in the living room felt heavy, completely absent of the frantic phone calls and demands that used to define my weekends. I walked into the kitchen and opened the refrigerator. Rows of neatly arranged groceries stared back at me. There were no expensive pressed juices for my sister, nor any imported creamers my mother insisted on keeping stocked. This house belonged entirely to me, and not a single relative possessed a key. 18 months earlier, Chelsea had forwarded me a massive tax notice and expected me to pay it. That was the day I closed our joint accounts, moved Mom to a fixed monthly allowance, stopped covering Chelsea's credit cards, and bought the townhouse in my name alone. I also began the Blue Ledger, recording every request, payment, and argument. The ledger started as proof that I was not imagining the pattern. It became the map I used to separate my family from my finances and, eventually, from the company. The quiet hum of my laptop broke the morning stillness. Caleb and Elena were already waiting on the secure video conference. I poured a cup of black coffee, sat at the kitchen island, and turned on my microphone. Our security director did not waste time with small talk. Caleb brought up a screen share displaying the access logs from the secure data room. He explained the forensic trap we had set 3 weeks ago. We had deliberately generated 3 different versions of the confidential valuation draft. Our chief operating officer received a copy listing the company at $48 million. The general counsel received a version valued at $52 million. The third draft carried the footer code C7H50. That specific document valued Hale Neuromotion at exactly $50 million and included the core patent consent language. Caleb highlighted a single row of data on the screen. My uncle opened and downloaded that exact file on Tuesday afternoon. 2 days later, my mother and sister used those precise terms against me at the dinner table. Then Caleb pulled up the printer logs from Friday afternoon. The transfer packet presented to me at the country club had been printed on the executive floor, But the user credential attached to the print job did not belong to our chief financial officer. The name on the screen belonged to Leah Park. Leah had been Craig's executive assistant for 4 years. A tight knot formed in my stomach. Craig had already sent an email to the special committee early this morning, claiming his assistant must have accessed the sensitive files without authorization. He insisted he was only trying to delete the folders late last night to protect company data after discovering her breach. Elena leaned forward into her camera frame, asking if we should suspend Leah immediately. I shook my head, watching the logs scroll past. Punishing a loyal employee based on circumstantial evidence was exactly how Craig operated. I told Caleb to pull the building access logs, the hallway security footage, and Leah's calendar for Friday afternoon. We were going to verify exactly who was sitting at that desk before anyone lost their job. A new notification chimed through the laptop speakers. Eleanor had just joined the secure channel, and the board chair looked exceptionally grim. Eleanor announced that my uncle had just escalated the situation past a simple corporate leak. Craig had officially submitted a scanned document to the board of directors, claiming it was a family contribution letter signed by my late father in March of 2015. According to the scan, my father stated his original $40,000 startup loan was actually a family investment, and he wanted 25% of the beneficial interest held specifically for Chelsea. My coffee turned sour in my mouth. My father passed away 5 years ago. Probate had been closed for years, and he had never mentioned a single word about equity. Eleanor read aloud from a sworn declaration submitted alongside the letter. My mother formally claimed that a minor basement leak on October 6th forced a plumber to move a heavy firebox. She stated she opened the box and discovered this letter sitting inside an unmarked envelope, completely by accident, just 10 days ago. Craig refused to hand over the original paper copy, claiming Barbara was terrified the company would destroy it. Our legal counsel warned us that the board could not just ignore the claim. Even though Chelsea was not a recognized shareholder, her attorneys were threatening to file an emergency injunction to block the sale of our patents. The rival buyer would halt all negotiations the second they sniffed a title dispute over the intellectual property. Craig was using the memory of a dead man to hold the entire company hostage. Eleanor adjusted her glasses and stared directly into her camera. She said Craig was demanding we halt the investigation, and he had my father's signature to force our hand. Elena and I spent the entirety of Tuesday morning pulling archived financial records from 11 years ago. The banking statements from 2015 were perfectly clear, laying out the exact financial foundation of my company. My father, Henry, had wired me $40,000 to purchase our first prototype components, and he required a strict promissory note for every single penny. I sat at my kitchen island, running my thumb over the worn edge of my old leather-bound ledger. The faint scent of his Old Spice aftershave almost seemed to linger on the yellowed pages. He had always been a deeply practical man. Sitting at our scratch dining table years ago, tapping his heavy silver pen against the wood, he told me that helping a child stand up did not mean owning their footsteps. I paid off the entire balance, along with the agreed-upon interest, in 2018. The legal acknowledgement carrying his signature sat right in front of me, completely refuting Craig's ridiculous narrative. Neither the founding stock ledger nor the final probate papers from 2022 mentioned a single share of equity belonging to anyone else in the family. The independent committee moved aggressively on the scanned letter. Caleb isolated the file properties by noon, and the digital footprint told a completely different story than my mother's sworn declaration. Barbara formally claimed she found the paper inside an unmarked envelope on October 6th, right after a minor plumbing leak forced a repairman to move a heavy firebox. Yet the metadata glowing on my laptop screen proved the PDF was actually generated on September 4th, over a full month before the supposed basement flood. Furthermore, the signature itself was a direct image copy lifted from a 2018 mortgage application, digitally pasted onto the page. Unfortunately, a digital footprint was not a smoking gun on its own. Craig continued to hide behind my mother, refusing to hand over the physical paper copy. He claimed Barbara was simply too terrified that my corporate lawyers would destroy the only evidence of her late husband's wishes. We needed that original document to prove exactly who manufactured the forgery. While we hunted for the physical evidence, Chelsea decided to try her luck in the court of public opinion. My assistant forwarded a link to a video circulating rapidly across social media. My younger sister sat in her impeccably decorated living room, dabbing her eyes with a tissue, perfectly framed by old family photographs. She painted a heartbreaking picture of a greedy older sibling, erasing her from the family legacy. The worst part was the edited video clip she attached to the post. Someone, likely a country club patron walking past the private dining room, had recorded the immediate aftermath of our Friday dinner. The footage conveniently skipped the moment my mother struck me across the face. Instead, the video started right as I pushed myself up from the rug. It showed me smoothing my blazer, offering a cold smile, and thanking them before walking out the door. Without the context of the physical assault, I looked like a ruthless, untouchable executive abandoning her weeping relatives. The corporate communications team panicked immediately. The director called my work phone 3 times in 10 minutes, begging me to release the urgent care medical records and publish the country club preservation request to clear my name. The urge to publicly humiliate my family burned hot in my chest. A single press release could destroy Chelsea's victim narrative in 10 seconds. Elena gently reminded me that firing back emotionally would only give them exactly what they wanted. If I launched a public attack, I would look like a wealthy chief executive, crushing her helpless mother and sister. We had to rely on the independent process. I took a deep breath, letting the anger settle back down into my stomach, and authorized a single, painfully dry statement. Hale Neuromotion maintained strict governance standards, and all ownership claims were currently under review by a special committee. The measured response did absolutely nothing to stop the bleeding. Our rival buyer formally notified the board that the public dispute violated the clean title clause of our letter of intent. The strategic partner officially paused all due diligence. Daniel Ortiz called me late Tuesday night, his voice tight with frustration. He warned that even a fragile, easily disproven lawsuit could tie up the intellectual property long enough to kill the entire $50 million transaction. The corporate coup was working perfectly. By sunrise, Chelsea's fabricated story had racked up 200,000 views, and the board had received a formal notice of an emergency injunction before I could even begin to fight back. Elena insisted I meet her in a private office downtown to review the security footage from the country club. The room was small and sterile, dominated by a large mahogany table that felt entirely too heavy for the gravity of what we were about to see. She pressed play on her laptop without saying a word. The grainy video showed the private dining room from a high corner angle. There was no sound, only the silent, clinical recording of my mother's betrayal. Barbara stood up, her face a mask of cold fury. She walked around the table with purposeful, measured steps, stopping only when she reached the edge of my chair. Then, the woman who raised me wound her arm back and delivered a sharp, decisive slap to my face. I saw my head snap to the side, my body tilting uncontrollably as the chair snagged on the thick rug. I went down hard, landing on the floor in a heap. The video footage was irrefutable. I sat in the dim light of Elena's office, the silent film playing on a loop, until my eyes burned. The incident report submitted by the club manager and the written statements from the 2 servers confirmed my account entirely. They noted that I never touched my mother, never shouted, and remained seated until she initiated the physical strike. Elena promised to hold the footage as a cornerstone of our defense, though I insisted we keep it offline for now, refusing to turn my own injury into a viral marketing campaign. My personal phone chimed, vibrating against the polished wood of the table. A message from my mother sat on the screen, cold and unrepentant. "I would never have hit you if you had not humiliated your sister," she had written. She did not express regret or ask if my wrist was broken. She simply justified the violence. I set the phone face down, feeling a strange, hollow sensation bloom in my chest. The special committee's investigation deepened as Caleb uncovered the bridge loan documentation. Barbara had signed for a $650,000 loan, using the house I had paid off for her as collateral. The loan memo laid out the strategy plainly, listing the success payment from the sale of my patents as the expected source of repayment. My mother had effectively bet the roof over her head on a plan to seize my assets, and she had done it knowing full well that my company was on the line. I waited until Caleb moved on to the next set of data before I asked about the broker's involvement. He pulled up the meeting notes from a conference call held just weeks before the dinner. The attendance sheet confirmed Barbara sat in that meeting, listening intently as the Compliance Council explained the specific implications of major holder rights. The notes showed my mother asked a direct question about my remaining control after the transfer. She had heard the answer that I would lose my majority standing and be left with 42%, and she proceeded anyway. The realization hit me harder than the fall on the rug. My mother was not some confused elderly victim being led astray by a scheming uncle. She understood the cost. She knew that by giving 25% to Chelsea, she was effectively stripping me of my ability to lead the company I built. She sat across from me at the dinner table, smiling about memories of my childhood, while actively negotiating my corporate execution. I excused myself from the call, walked to my car, and sat in the silence for a long time. I thought about the thousands of hours I spent in the lab, the years I spent sacrificing weekends and social lives to ensure their financial security. I had truly believed their love was a reflection of my service to them. Now, looking at the broker notes, I understood that they never viewed me as a daughter. I was a resource. I was a battery to be drained until nothing remained. My work phone rang, vibrating incessantly in my pocket. It was a formal notice from Orbis Mobility. They had caught wind of the internal title dispute and the leak. The letter stated that the ongoing chaos breached the terms of our confidential letter of intent. They were threatening to walk away from the $50 million valuation entirely, demanding that I step aside from the negotiations immediately. The move was clearly designed to put maximum pressure on the board to force a settlement. The air in the cabin felt thin. I needed to move, to act, to stop the collapse, but my hands remained frozen on the wheel. I had spent my entire life shielding them from the consequences of their choices. I stared at the dark screen of my phone, knowing that if I walked back into that boardroom, I could save them, but only by destroying myself. The boardroom felt like an icebox. I sat at the far end of the long mahogany table, my hands tucked beneath my thighs to hide the slight tremor that had taken hold after reading the Orbis Mobility threat. Eleanor Shaw, our board chair, sat directly across from me. Her expression remained entirely unreadable, the kind of professional mask she had spent decades perfecting. Surrounding us were the other members of the special committee, each looking more apprehensive than the last. Craig sat near the door, his posture leaning back, radiating a practiced, casual confidence. The resolution creating this special committee had been finalized within hours of my call. Elena sat at my right, her laptop open to the draft of our recusal agreement. My throat felt dry as I listened to the committee counsel explain the rules. To maintain the absolute integrity of the investigation, both Craig and I had to relinquish control over company records related to the ownership claim. Neither of us would be permitted to direct the forensic team or communicate with the broker until the committee reached a preliminary conclusion. Craig tapped his pen against his chin, feigning a look of deep concern for the company's future. He spoke with that familiar, patronizing warmth he always reserved for when he thought he was winning. He told the board he was truly devastated that this family situation had spilled into the workplace. My uncle suggested that for the sake of the employees and our pending sale, I should step aside from my daily duties entirely until the dust settled. It was a calculated move. If I were out of the building, he would have full access to the staff and the remaining internal servers. I did not have to look at the security footage or the broker notes to know exactly who had planted the idea of an ownership dispute. Chelsea had already posted a new video to her social media accounts, this time filming herself standing in front of our main office entrance. She called herself a co-founder in every caption, painting me as a ruthless sister who had stolen her birthright. The sight of her posing in front of the Hale Neuromotion logo, wearing that fake, tearful expression, turned my stomach. Elena pressed her hand against my forearm, a silent warning to keep my temper buried. I agreed to the terms of the recusal. I would step back from all executive decisions concerning the investigation and the ownership claim for 72 hours. The chief operating officer would oversee the daily operations. It felt like a defeat to hand over the keys to the kingdom I had spent 11 years building, but I knew my history. I had built this company on systems, not on ego. I trusted those systems now. Walking out of the building proved to be the most humiliating moment of my professional life. A security guard waited by the glass doors, holding a small cardboard box. I packed my personal items in under 2 minutes. My family photos, a few pens, and a spare pair of glasses. I avoided the eyes of the administrative assistants as I walked to the lobby. Some of them watched me with genuine concern. Others whispered behind their hands, likely wondering if I had truly embezzled family money. I refused to stop. I refused to justify myself to them. As I reached the main exit, the temporary recusal protocols I had helped design took effect. I swiped my company badge at the reader. A sharp beep echoed through the lobby, followed by a red flash. Access denied. The special committee had suspended both my access and Craig's for the 72-hour review, exactly as the policy required. Chelsea was waiting for me just past the lobby glass. She had a press crew with her, cameras rolling as she watched me stand outside in the light drizzle. She adjusted her blazer, composed her features into a mask of righteous martyrdom, and began speaking into a microphone. She claimed she came here to protect the family legacy, acting as if she had the moral authority to claim half the building. I stood on the wet pavement, watching her smile for the cameras through the glass. She looked so happy, so convinced that she had finally won. She did not know that the system I built was not tied to my badge. It was tied to the audit trail I had meticulously constructed across every server we owned. My badge was just a piece of plastic. The truth, however, remained stored in the digital archives Craig thought he was managing. I turned around, walked to my car, and did not spare another glance at the woman standing there playing the part of a martyr. The red light of the card reader was not a failure. It was the final check on my trap. I was finally, completely out of the way. And that was exactly where I needed them to think I was. The silence in my townhouse felt foreign, a stark contrast to the relentless noise of the corporate office I had occupied for over a decade. I woke up at 5 a.m, my hand instinctively reaching for the spot on my nightstand where my company badge usually sat. When my fingers met only cold wood, a sharp jolt of disorientation flickered through me before the reality settled. I did not have to be at the office. I did not have to field calls from the marketing team or worry about the supply chain metrics. For the first time in years, the morning belonged entirely to me. I pulled on my sneakers and headed out for a long walk through the quiet neighborhood. The air in Raleigh carried that crisp, damp bite of mid-October, and the trees were turning a deep, bruised crimson. I met a friend for coffee at a small cafe a few miles away. She asked how things were at the company, assuming the rumors on the internet were just typical executive drama. I sipped my latte, watching a stray dog trot across the street, and chose not to burden her with the details of family betrayal. We talked about her children, the upcoming holidays, and the books she was reading. It felt like a tether to a life that existed outside the orbit of Hail Neuromotion. A life that I had been slowly rebuilding for the past 18 months. I realized then that while Craig and Chelsea had tried to isolate me, they had failed to destroy the foundation of my own existence. By noon, I was back home, opening a secure, encrypted channel to the board's independent investigators. Eleanor sent me a summary of the latest developments. While I was sidelined, the chief operating officer had kept the company running smoothly. She informed me that when Chelsea's public relations firm contacted our internal marketing team to demand the company officially endorse her as a co-founder, our staff flatly refused. The employees were nervous, certainly, but they remained loyal to the work we were doing. They saw the value in the medical devices we built, and they did not care for the spectacle my sister was trying to stage in the lobby. I moved to the next file in the report. Leah Park, the executive assistant my uncle had tried to frame, was completely in the clear. Caleb had pulled the building access logs, and they showed Leah walking out of the lobby to head to her physical therapy appointment nearly 40 minutes before the printing job was initiated. We had hallway security footage showing Craig walking into her office right as she left. The printer logs were accessed using her credentials, but the physical timestamps confirmed it was impossible for her to have been the one to print the transfer packet. Leah, terrified and bewildered by the accusation, had reached out to Elena to provide a screenshot of her personal calendar showing the exact time of her appointment. She also provided a separate document showing she had explicitly blocked out that time on Craig's own calendar a week earlier. Caleb successfully recovered a temporary file from the workstation Craig had been using. The metadata properties confirm the document was created on the Chief Financial Officer's own user account, then saved to a shared network folder before being moved to the printer queue. The path led directly to my uncle, then pointed toward an email attachment sent to my sister's private account. The setup was not just malicious, it was sloppy, born from the arrogance of a man who assumed he would never be questioned. My personal phone vibrated on the kitchen island. A new message appeared from an unknown number. It was a formal settlement offer drafted by Craig's personal attorney. The proposal was simple, framed in the language of a desperate olive branch. They were willing to back down from the ownership claim if I agreed to give Chelsea 10% of the company instead of 25%. They promised the company would not initiate any litigation regarding the leak. My mother would get to keep her house, and Craig would resign quietly. In return, I had to sign a mutual non-disclosure agreement and drop the investigation entirely. The offer hung in the air, a tempting illusion of peace. It would end the scandal, save my mother's home, and allow me to return to my desk without the stain of public litigation. The attorney included a secondary threat, buried at the bottom of the document like a jagged piece of glass. They claimed to have possession of an email chain proving I had been using company funds to pay for my family's lifestyle for years. He wrote that if I did not accept the settlement by the morning of the board hearing, they would release those records to the press to prove I was embezzling from my own company. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding a rhythm of pure, cold anger. The email chain was real. I remembered the requests for expensive family trips and personal consultations, but Craig had purposefully clipped the messages. He had deleted the final lines of every single exchange, the lines where I specifically instructed the accountant to deduct those amounts from my personal distribution or where I provided my own check to cover the costs. He was weaponizing my past generosity against me, betting that I would rather cave to their extortion than have my reputation smeared. I did not respond to the offer. Instead, I sent a single text to Elena, asking her to meet me at the townhouse in an hour. I needed to see the ledger. My fingers hovered over the keyboard as I thought about the board hearing scheduled for tomorrow morning. They wanted to turn my own kindness into the engine of my destruction. I reached for the blue folder I had kept hidden in my home office, the record of every penny I had ever moved, and prepared to show them that I had been anticipating this betrayal for a long time. They wanted to play a game of forensic accounting, and I was holding all the cards. Elena arrived at my townhouse just as the afternoon light began to fade, casting long, sharp shadows across my study. I had the blue ledger laid open on the desk, the pages dense with the history of my family's financial dependence and my slow, methodical attempt to untangle myself from their grasp. My attorney sat across from me, her eyes moving rapidly as she scanned the rows of data. We spent the next 3 hours organizing the evidence into 3 distinct categories. The first group contained personal expenses I had paid for directly out of my own pocket, proving I never treated family bills as company debt. The second category included temporary loans the company had processed, all of which I had reimbursed with bank transfers. The final category was the most damning for Craig. It documented every instance where my uncle had manually altered the accounting classifications after I explicitly requested that the charges be billed to my personal distribution. I did not try to hide the truth from my legal counsel. I confessed that for years, I had turned a blind eye to the nepotism, fearing that if I enforced strict governance, I would lose the only family I had left. My voice did not shake as I explained that this was a failure of management, not a crime of theft. I had been weak, certainly, but I had not been a thief. Elena listened intently, taking notes, her expression softening just enough to let me know she understood the distinction. My admission of these governance mistakes only made the evidence of my later corrective actions more credible. When I presented the board minutes from 18 months ago, showing the specific resolution where I ordered the related party freeze and terminated the non-compliant consulting contracts, Elena finally nodded. This timeline proved that I had started cutting them off long before Craig realized he was losing his lifestyle. We prepared a comprehensive brief for the special committee, complete with the full email chains that Craig had carefully clipped. When restored to their original form, the messages showed me clearly stating, with every request for payment, that the costs must be deducted from my personal share. I had been meticulous, and my bank transfer records provided the final, undeniable validation. Each check I cut, each wire transfer I initiated to settle these personal family obligations was logged and tracked. My uncle had assumed I was naive enough to let him define the narrative, but he had underestimated the very systems I implemented to keep his department honest. The forensic team had also been hard at work. Late that afternoon, the lead investigator arrived with the result we needed regarding the family contribution letter. The lab expert had examined the physical document that Barbara finally surrendered, the one she claimed was found in a firebox following a basement leak. The analysis was conclusive. The expert identified that the text, the header, and the signature were all generated by the same office printer. There were no indentations from a pen, no variation in the toner density that would indicate a manual signature, and no sign of aging on the paper itself. It was a digital composite, printed on a standard laserjet, and subsequently handled to look worn. When this evidence was paired with the metadata showing the file creation date from early September, the entire story about the basement leak and the surprise discovery in a box from 2015 collapsed under its own weight. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the weight in my chest begin to lift, though the tension of the upcoming board hearing still clawed at the back of my neck. I asked Elena to bring up the recorded broker call. It was a file I had dreaded hearing, yet I knew it was the only way to silence the last remaining doubts the board might harbor. The audio started with a clear, professional introduction from the broker's compliance counsel. Craig spoke first, his voice confident and booming as he outlined the major holder rights and the veto power he wanted Chelsea to exercise. Then came the sound of my sister laughing, asking about her success fee, sounding more like a predator than a daughter. Finally, my mother spoke. The clarity of her voice in the sterile room made my breath catch in my throat. She asked if Morgan would really be stripped of control, and when Craig assured her that my voting power would be permanently reduced to 42%, she uttered a simple, chilling sentence. Once Chelsea has the veto, Morgan won't have a choice. I stared at the closed laptop, the silence in my study ringing louder than the recording had. I had spent my entire life searching for evidence of their love, only to find the definitive proof of their malice. There was no misunderstanding, no confusion, and no innocent mistake. They had known exactly what the result would be, and they had chosen that path with open eyes. The realization brought a strange kind of peace. I finally understood that protecting myself did not make me a bad person, and it certainly did not make me a bad daughter. It just meant I was no longer willing to be the victim of their greed. The next few hours were spent in a blur of organization. We indexed the ledger, the forensic findings, the metadata reports, and the recorded call. Elena checked the digital folders twice to ensure everything was accessible for the morning hearing. I felt a cold, focused resolve taking hold. I was ready to walk into that boardroom and dismantle the house of cards they had spent months building. I noticed a flicker of activity on my work phone, an incoming message from the broker's office, sent to our legal department. They were formally severing ties with Chelsea. The firm had discovered that she provided fraudulent representations during the due diligence process and were distancing themselves from her completely. They wanted to avoid being implicated in the injunction claim or the forged letter submission. One by one, the people who had helped her build this coup were realizing the risk was too high to continue. She was losing her allies, she was losing her financial leverage, and soon she would be forced to face the reality of the situation without a safety net. I walked to the window and looked out at the street. The sun had completely vanished, and the streetlights were flickering to life, illuminating the quiet neighborhood. I thought about the life I had built here. A life separate from the chaos of my family. I had paid for this independence with years of hard work, only for them to treat it like an inheritance I had stolen from them. The board hearing tomorrow would be the final test of the governance structures I put in place. I had to convince the committee that my past failings in oversight did not invalidate my current position as CEO. I had to prove that I was capable of making the difficult decisions, including the ones that might finally destroy the illusion of our family. Elena caught my eye and gestured toward the laptop. We had done everything we could. There were no more documents to find, no more records to restore, and no more conversations to analyze. Everything was set for the final reckoning. She stood up to leave, promising to meet me at the office building at 8 in the morning. I watched her go, then stood in the quiet study, the blue ledger still open on my desk. I knew what I had to do, and I knew exactly who I was doing it for. The company, the employees, and the future I had envisioned for the clinic were worth every moment of the pain I was enduring. I looked at the photograph of the board members pinned to my corkboard, trying to anticipate the questions they would ask, the doubts they would raise, and the evidence I would provide to shatter every one of them. I was going to finish this, not for them, and not for the family legacy they tried to weaponize, but for the life I had fought so hard to reclaim. I turned off the desk lamp, leaving the room in darkness, and finally prepared to face the next day with the clarity that only truth could provide. The boardroom at Hale Neuromotion was not designed for the level of tension currently suffocating the room. I took my seat at exactly 8 in the morning, watching the heavy oak door click shut as the committee members filed in. Eleanor Shaw took the center position, her face as composed as a mountain, while Daniel Ortiz sat to her left, his arms crossed over his chest, waiting to see if his investment was about to evaporate. My Uncle Craig occupied the far corner, wearing a suit that cost more than my first car, his posture oozing a practiced, arrogant ease that suggested he still believed the board would protect him out of habit. Chelsea joined via a secure video link, her image projected onto the oversized monitor behind Eleanor, looking small and polished, ready to perform her latest role as the aggrieved victim. Eleanor opened the hearing by establishing the ground rules with clinical brevity. She stated that the discussion would strictly cover corporate governance, ownership records, forensic data, and the professional conduct of the executive staff. There would be no room for emotional appeals, and any attempt to reframe the meeting as a private family dispute would result in immediate dismissal. Craig went first, leaning into the microphone to deliver his prepared narrative. He spoke of my father's dying wishes, weaving a story about an old man who wanted his family to remain united through the company. He painted me as someone who had drifted away from my roots, implying my obsession with corporate efficiency had blinded me to the moral obligation of taking care of my own flesh and blood. When the committee asked about the document discrepancies, he sighed with theatrical disappointment, pointing a finger directly at Leah Park. He claimed she had managed the print queue and likely manipulated the files in a misguided effort to help him. He insisted he only tried to delete the folders to safeguard company secrets, a transparently desperate lie that made the forensic investigator on the committee shake his head in visible disdain. Elena stood up, her movements graceful and precise, and began to dismantle his defense piece by piece. She displayed the access logs on the screen, showing the exact time Craig opened the C7H50 valuation draft. Then, she pulled up the printer queue logs for the executive floor, showing the document printing at a time when Leah Park was documented by badge records and hallway cameras to be at a physical therapy clinic 3 miles away. Elena did not need to shout. She simply presented the cold, hard sequence of events. When Craig tried to argue that the print logs were tampered with, Elena presented the file properties from the temporary folder on his workstation. She revealed that the document was created under his login credentials, then saved to a shared folder, and eventually attached to an email sent from his internal account to my sister. The room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. Next, we addressed the family contribution letter. Elena laid the forensic report on the table, pointing to the expert conclusion that the signature and the body of the text were printed simultaneously by a laserjet, leaving no room for the argument that it was a handwritten relic from 2015. I kept my eyes on Craig. His casual posture had completely vanished. He shifted in his chair, his face losing its color, the practiced arrogance replaced by a frantic, darting gaze. Finally, we reached the recorded broker call. The committee sat in stillness as the audio filled the room, the sound of my mother's voice asking for confirmation about the veto power, followed by the terrifying certainty in her tone when she realized I would have no choice, echoed off the walls. I kept my expression neutral, my hands resting calmly on the table. The damage was done. The recording stripped away any remaining pretense that this was a misunderstanding between loving relatives. Craig lunged forward, his voice cracking as he shouted that I was ungrateful, that I would never have built a single prototype without the foundation he and my father had provided. The mask finally dropped. He stood up, pointing at me, his face twisted into a mask of pure entitlement. He did not care about the patients or the technology. He cared only for the status and the wealth he felt he was owed by birthright. It was the most honest thing he had ever said to me. Eleanor did not yell back. She simply looked at him, her gaze unimpressed and freezing. She announced that the committee was recommending his immediate termination for cause, based on the forensic evidence of fiduciary breach and the malicious creation of forged documents. The room felt lighter, the oxygen returning as the board members began to murmur their consensus. Chelsea's image on the screen flickered as her lawyers tried to intervene, but Eleanor effectively muted the audio, signaling that the hearing had moved past her participation. We concluded the hearing by outlining the legal next steps. Hale Neuromotion would initiate a formal lawsuit against my uncle for breach of fiduciary duty and damage to the corporation. The broker had already severed their agreement with my sister, leaving her to face the consequences of the fraudulent warranty she signed alone. As the meeting broke up, Craig remained slumped in his chair, his career and his influence evaporating in the span of an hour. I stood to leave, my legs feeling solid for the first time in weeks. As I neared the exit, Craig stopped me, his voice lowered to a desperate, jagged whisper. He grabbed my sleeve, pleading with me to consider a private deal. He insisted that if I walked away from the patent lawsuit and granted Chelsea a small percentage, Barbara could save the house and we could all go back to being a family. He was still trying to use the same lever, still trying to trade the future of my life for the maintenance of his lies. I pulled my arm away, looking at him with a detachment that surprised even myself. I told him that the house, the fake letter, and the bridge loan were all choices they made for themselves. I would not use the sweat and equity of my employees and investors to purchase the illusion of a family that never existed. I left him sitting there, in the echoing silence of the room he had tried to take from me. Outside, the air felt crisp and clean, tasting of a new beginning. Elena caught up to me by the elevators, her face reflecting a cautious relief. She told me the news was already spreading, that the internal team was preparing to address the staff, and the board was drafting the public press release to correct the record Chelsea had tried to destroy. I did not care about the public optics or the headlines. My focus was entirely on the message Elena had received moments ago. My mother was waiting at my townhouse in Raleigh, carrying a single suitcase and the final notice of foreclosure, believing she could still move the pieces around the board one last time. I walked to my car knowing that the most difficult part of the day was still waiting for me, but for the first time I felt no fear. I had the ledger, the evidence, and the truth. The final confrontation would be played out on my terms, in the house that I owned, and it would be the very last thing I ever gave them. The late afternoon sun warmed the front porch of my Raleigh townhouse, reflecting off the glass of the front door where my mother stood. She wore a light wool coat against the cool October air, clutching a battered suitcase with both hands. A legal document protruded from her handbag, the unmistakable bold headers of a bank foreclosure notice catching the light. She looked smaller than I remembered, her shoulders hunched as if expecting a blow. I walked out to meet her, the heels of my boots clicking against the concrete, a sound that seemed unnervingly loud in the quiet neighborhood. Barbara did not move when I approached, her gaze fixed on the front door as if she were waiting for me to step aside and welcome her back into the fold. She spoke in that soft, tremulous tone she had refined over the years, telling me that Chelsea was spiraling into a deep depression and that Craig had finally gone silent after the hearing. She whispered that the bank was coming for the country clubhouse at the end of the month. My mother looked at me with those familiar, pleading eyes, clearly expecting me to reach into my purse and write a check to stop the world from collapsing around her. I stayed on the porch, my hands tucked into my pockets, feeling the steady rhythm of my own heart. I told her that she had signed the bridge loan with full knowledge of the consequences, and I was not going to undo that choice. I offered her a printed folder instead. It contained the contact information for a reputable attorney specializing in property liquidation and a list of local housing resources for seniors who needed to downsize quickly. I explained that she could sell the remaining assets, pay off the primary debt, and walk away with enough to secure a smaller, manageable apartment. I was offering her a path to stability, but it was a path that required her to let go of the lifestyle she had used to control me. Barbara did not touch the folder. She started to cry, the jagged, performative sobs echoing off the townhouse siding. She accused me of being cold, of punishing her for a mistake that was mostly Craig's doing, and of abandoning my sister when she needed me most. I watched her, really watched her, and felt a strange sense of distance. There was no rage left, only a clear, piercing realization that I was no longer the daughter who would trade her own future to buy their comfort. I told her I would not pay the bridge loan, and I would not buy back the house. I offered to help her find a realtor, and promised to provide a small trust for her medical expenses, but that was the absolute limit of my involvement. She could accept my terms, or she could fight the bank alone. When she realized I was not going to waver, the crying stopped as abruptly as it had started, her expression hardening into the familiar, cutting stare of a woman who felt entitled to everything. She told me I would regret this, turned on her heel, and walked toward her waiting taxi, leaving the foreclosure notice forgotten on the porch floor. My conversation with Chelsea later that week was far less complex. She called from a number I did not recognize, her voice shrill and demanding. She claimed we were sisters, that this was all just a temporary misunderstanding, and that I should call the board to withdraw the fraud claims so she could get her brokerage retainer back. I stopped her mid-sentence. I told her that she asked for ownership, and she got exactly what she bargained for: the full, unvarnished responsibility of her own actions. I would not give her a single share, I would not help her pay the broker back, and I would not pretend that we had a relationship. I hung up, deleted the number, and did not check my phone for the rest of the night. The months that followed were quiet. Chelsea sold most of her designer wardrobe and a car she could no longer afford to fund a negotiated repayment settlement with the brokerage firm. The legal fallout for Craig continued, with depositions and court filings dragging on through the summer, but the company itself remained untouched. I kept my word regarding my mother, providing for her basic health needs through the trust, but the country clubhouse was sold at auction. Barbara moved into a modest apartment in the city, and I heard through the grapevine that she spent her afternoons complaining to anyone who would listen about the daughter who had made something of herself only to become a stranger. By April of 2027, the dogwoods in the front yard of my townhouse were in full bloom, their white petals dusting the walkway. Hale Neuromotion was stronger than it had ever been. We moved away from the deal with the rival buyer, opting instead for a partnership that allowed us to keep our proprietary technology in-house. I promoted the engineers who had actually developed our core systems, establishing a merit-based equity program that ensured the people who built the company were the ones who truly owned its success. I hired a new chief financial officer through a rigorous, independent headhunting process, and the board implemented a permanent ban on any related party hiring without a unanimous committee vote. On a warm evening, I invited Elena, Eleanor, and a few of my oldest friends from the lab over for dinner. The house felt warm and filled with genuine laughter. There were no hidden agendas, no requests for loans, and no manufactured crises to solve. My old personal phone sat in a junk drawer, the battery long dead, its number changed and forgotten. I did not need to keep people close just because of the names they used in their contacts. The people sitting around my dining table were there because they respected my work and cared for me as a human being, not as a source of capital or an instrument of their ambition. I sat at the head of the table, listening to the soft clinking of wine glasses and the comfortable, easy cadence of conversation. I remembered the night at the country club, the feeling of the hardwood floor against my palm, and the terrifying silence that followed when I realized I was truly alone. I had been so afraid of that silence, convinced it meant I had failed. But now, as I looked at the friends who had helped me navigate the wreckage, the quiet felt like an exhale. I picked up my napkin and folded it, watching the evening light settle into the corners of the room. For the first time, silence did not sound like abandonment. It sounded like my life. You might think that blood is thicker than water, but this story teaches us that healthy boundaries are the truest form of love. You have every right to protect your hard-earned success, even if it means walking away from those who only value you for what you can provide. Do not mistake guilt for obligation, and remember that real family earns their place in your life through respect and genuine support, not through manipulation or entitlement. If you find yourself constantly sacrificing your peace just to keep the peace for someone else, please know that it is not your job to fund their comfort at the expense of your own security. You are the architect of your own boundaries, and you deserve a life free from the weight of others' greed. Have you ever had to draw a line in the sand with someone you love? And how did that decision change your life?